The sound of seagulls echoed faintly through the narrow streets of Whitby, their cries swallowed by the wind that swept inland from the grey North Sea. Claire Montague sat alone in the front room of her aging Victorian home on Marine Parade, her tea lukewarm, her sketchbook untouched on her lap. The house creaked around her, old floorboards shifting like sighs of memory. It was a cold March afternoon, the kind that blurred time. Claire's life had become a careful routine since her divorce 8 years ago. She taught watercolor techniques at the local college, walked along the cliffs every Saturday morning, and spent the rest of her time preserving what was left of the house her mother had once adored. But lately, something had begun to change. A thin crack had appeared along the edge of the parlor wall, just beneath the old family painting of a moorland landscape. At first, she ignored it. Houses shifted. Old walls moved. But within a week, the crack had lengthened and spidered out, flaking plaster onto the carpet. Now, the wallpaper near the skirting board was beginning to bubble. Damp. Claire knew she could not ignore it any longer. She called in a local builder named Martin Willis, a stocky man in his early 60s with hands like shovels and a thick Yorkshire accent. He arrived with a dusty toolkit and a quiet confidence that put her oddly at ease. "Best to get behind that plaster, love," he said, eyeing the wall. "Moisture's likely coming in from the stonework. Might be summit hidden back there too. Old houses have their secrets." Claire offered a polite smile, unsure if he was joking. She moved her easel and the old sideboard away from the wall and watched as Martin began to chisel. The noise was sharp and jarring, cracking open decades of stillness. Dust rose in soft clouds. Then, suddenly, his hammer struck something solid, something that sounded different. Martin leaned in. "There's summit wedged in here." He cleared the debris gently, and from behind the lath and plaster, he pulled out a frame. It was wooden, thin, and covered in grime. The glass had shattered long ago, but the photograph inside remained mostly intact. Claire stepped forward, drawn to it without understanding why. The photograph showed a young woman standing in front of a walled garden. She wore a pale dress, high-necked, with lace detailing at the sleeves, Edwardian, perhaps. Her hair was swept up, and there was something haunting in her gaze. The image was yellowed but clear. On the back of the frame, written in elegant handwriting, were the words, "For Violet, my one true love. H." Claire's heart stilled. She had never heard the name Violet before. Not once in all the stories her mother had told her about their family. And she had certainly never seen this woman's face in the albums that lay in the dresser drawer upstairs. "Family of yours?" Martin asked, brushing the dust from his sleeves. I don't think so," Claire murmured, staring at the name again. Violet. Who was she? And why had someone hidden her picture behind a wall? Claire took the photograph and held it close, feeling the weight of a secret long buried. Her mind raced with questions she could not yet form. But deep within her, something had shifted. A thread had been pulled from the fabric of her quiet life. And it would unravel everything. That evening, Claire placed the photograph gently on the kitchen table, the overhead light casting a yellow glow over the sepia tones. She stared at the woman's face as though it might suddenly speak, confess its story with a flicker of expression. But the silence in the house was deep and unbroken, disturbed only by the low hum of the old refrigerator. She ran her fingers lightly along the edge of the frame. Violet. It was not a name that had ever been uttered in their family. Her mother, Frances Montague, had been fiercely proud of their lineage, full of headmasters, seamstresses, and one amateur botanist who had written a book about North Yorkshire mosses. Frances had kept the family history like a cathedral, sacred and orderly. No mention of a Violet. No H either. Claire pulled out her mother's old biscuit tin from the cupboard, the one that rattled with birth certificates, ration cards, and brittle newspaper clippings. She spent nearly an hour sifting through its contents, but found nothing, no photographs matching the young woman, no letter signed by an H. Her curiosity grew heavier with each unanswered question. She tried to sleep, but her dreams were restless and fragmented, fragments of a walled garden, whispered names, and that same face watching her from beyond the years. The next morning, Claire rose before the sun. She wrapped herself in a wool coat and walked down the cobbled hill to the Whitby Archive Centre, a squat building near the Abbey ruins where she had once taken her students for local history projects. The centre was quiet, the air tinged with the smell of old paper and damp floorboards. Behind the desk sat Mr. Tennant, a man who had spent the last 3 decades surrounded by dusty maps and death records. His eyes lit up when he saw Claire. "Back to dig through the past, are we?" he asked with a warm smile. "I think the past has come digging for me," Claire replied, and showed him the photograph. He squinted at it, then turned it over and read the inscription aloud. "For Violet, my one true love. H." He leaned back, thoughtful. "That handwriting, it's proper. Not modern. Possibly Edwardian or early interwar. Where did you find this?" "Behind a wall in my parlor," Claire said. "Buried beneath the plaster." "Well," he said, rising from his chair with more energy than expected, "let's see what we can find." Together, they pored over census records, property deeds, and parish listings. Whitby had no shortage of Montagues in the early 20th century, but no Violet appeared on record as part of Claire's family line. Then, after nearly 2 hours of quiet rustling and whispers, Mr. Tennant paused. He tapped a fragile document with a bony finger. "There. Look. Violet Elmsworth. Lived at number 12 Marine Parade in 1910. That's 2 doors down from your house." Claire leaned closer. The record was brief, but it stated that Violet had been a living companion to a widowed woman named Mrs. Cartwright. No marriage. No children. And then, gone. No further entries. No death record in Whitby. No emigration note. "She vanished," Claire whispered. "Or she left. Or was taken," Mr. Tennant said, voice dropping slightly. "Back then, if a woman fell into scandal." Claire stared at the name again. Violet Elmsworth. It rolled through her thoughts like a storm swell. Who had written the note to her? Who was H? She thanked Mr. Tennant and walked home along the edge of the cliff path, the wind fierce against her coat. Below, the sea churned grey and white. Her mind was no quieter than the waters. That evening, Claire took the photo and placed it beside her easel. She opened a new canvas and began to paint, not the landscape she had planned, but the face from the photo. The long neck. The haunted eyes. The garden, half seen in the background. With every brushstroke, she felt closer. Not just to Violet, but to something locked deep within her own bones. A silence that stretched across generations. The painting would not be finished that night. But as the final light of day faded behind the hills, Claire stepped back and looked at her work. Violet's face was taking form, and in it, a flicker of recognition. Claire gasped softly. It was not just resemblance. There was something familiar about that face. And it was not just her imagination. 2 days passed, but Claire could not shake the feeling that the photograph had somehow shifted something in her world. Her routine, once a comforting rhythm, now felt hollow, each cup of tea, each brushstroke at the college, tinged with distraction. She had begun dreaming of the walled garden. It returned night after night. In the dreams, she stood before a crumbling brick wall covered in ivy, the iron gate slightly ajar. Beyond it, shadows of roses danced in the wind. Sometimes, Violet stood on the other side, silent, beckoning. Other times, the garden was empty, but Claire always woke with the scent of earth and old stone lingering in her nose. On Sunday morning, unable to bear the stillness of her own home, she put on her boots and walked down Marine Parade. The street was quiet, the sea beyond shrouded in mist. She stopped outside number 12. It was a tall, narrow house with weathered shutters and faded curtains. For years, it had been owned by the Cartwright family, just as the record had said. But the current owners, the Baxters, had only recently moved in. Claire hesitated, then knocked. A woman in her 60s answered. She had sharp eyes and short grey curls. "Hello, I'm Claire Montague. I live just down the street. I know this is a bit odd, but may I ask if your garden has a brick wall?" The woman raised a brow. "It did. We had it knocked down last summer." "Why?" Claire tried to hide her disappointment. "Just curious. I heard the house had quite a history." "Oh, it does. My husband's always digging up strange bits. He found an old silver comb in the rose bed and a locket with no picture. Gave me the chills." Claire swallowed hard. "May I see the garden?" The woman nodded, stepping aside. Out back, the space was neat and modern, raised beds, a patio, trellises with sweet peas climbing up. But on the far side, Claire could still see the faint imprint in the ground where a wall once stood. Earth slightly sunken. Ivy creeping across soil as if remembering the shape. She stepped closer. In the corner, nearly hidden beneath an overgrown lavender bush, was a stone bench. It was cracked, mottled with moss, but unmistakably old. Claire knelt and brushed her hand across its surface. There, etched faintly into the stone, were initials. V.E. plus H.M. Her breath caught. H.M. Whoever he was, he had sat here. With Violet. Perhaps kissed her hand beneath the ivy. Perhaps whispered promises he could not keep. She turned to the woman. "Would you mind terribly if I took a photograph of this?" "Not at all," she replied. "Just watch your step, the lavender's been wild since spring." Claire snapped the photo on her phone, then stood still for a moment longer, staring at the bench, imagining the echoes of laughter, the ghosts of love once lived. That evening, back in her kitchen, she opened her laptop and typed into the search bar, H.M. Violet Elmsworth Whitby 1910. The first page revealed nothing of use. But on the third, buried in a digital archive of forgotten Yorkshire journals, a single entry caught her eye. Captain Henry Montague. Local landowner's son. Disappeared under mysterious circumstances in 1911. Last seen leaving a boarding house in Whitby. Rumors of scandal involving a woman employed at number 12 Marine Parade. Claire's fingers trembled. Montague. She clicked the article, scanning each line as if her life depended on it. Henry Montague. Born in 1883. Son of Edmund Montague of Ravenshill Hall. Served briefly in the Royal Engineers. No known marriage. No known children. And no official record after 1911. Her heart raced. She leaned back in her chair, the photo of Violet still sitting near her easel. Could it be? Could Henry be part of her family line, one that had been erased, silenced? And if so, had Violet's story been deliberately buried? A creak from upstairs startled her. The house groaned in the evening wind, but Claire could not shake the feeling that something, someone, was waiting to be found. And this time, she would not turn away. Eleanor stood on the back step, staring at the overgrown garden that once brimmed with roses, lavender, and James's beloved delphiniums. Now, the paths were lost beneath brambles, the stone birdbath cracked and moss-covered, and a rusted swing creaked in the wind, swaying though no one touched it. In her hand, she held another letter. This one was different. It had no envelope, only a ribbon, faded lilac, holding its folded pages together. The handwriting was unmistakably James's, but the tone had shifted. There was urgency in his words, desperation even. He mentioned a night in Bristol, a decision he could not take back, and a woman named Clara. Clara. Eleanor whispered the name aloud, letting it settle on her tongue. It meant nothing to her, yet. She took to the shed, rummaging through old files, James's tools, anything that might point to this woman. At the bottom of an old tin box, beneath cracked vinyl records and oil-stained gloves, she found a photograph. It was black and white, faded at the edges. James, young, smiling, full of life, stood beside a dark-haired woman in a floral dress. Her eyes, though kind, were cautious. Behind them was a theatre sign, Colston Hall, Bristol, 1995. Eleanor's breath caught. That was the year James told her he was away for a legal conference in Leeds. Bristol was nowhere near Leeds. She slipped the photograph into her coat pocket and headed back into the house. Her laptop felt foreign beneath her fingers as she typed in keywords, Colston Hall, 1995, Clara Bristol Theatre. One name came up again and again, Clara Montague, a stage actress, now retired. Within 20 minutes, Eleanor had found an address. It wasn't far. A village just beyond Bath. The next morning, she packed a small bag, locked the house behind her, and set off. The drive was long and winding, past green fields and rain-dusted hills. She had always found comfort in the English countryside, but today it felt like the land was holding its breath, waiting for her to arrive. The village was quiet, with just a corner shop and a post box painted in dull red. The address led to a small stone cottage with white shutters and a wild garden. Honeysuckle crept up the walls, and a black cat watched her from the windowsill, its eyes steady and unreadable. Eleanor knocked once. The door opened slowly. And there, standing before her, was the woman from the photograph. A little older, her hair grayer, but unmistakably her. Clara Montague? Eleanor asked, her voice steadier than she felt. The woman didn't answer. She simply stepped aside and said, I wondered when someone might come. The inside of Clara Montague's cottage smelled faintly of bergamot and wood smoke. A fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth barely touching the cool tension in the air. Eleanor sat across from Clara in an armchair that sagged slightly, as though burdened by too many memories. Clara handed her a porcelain cup of tea, her fingers trembling just enough to betray nerves. Eleanor's gaze remained fixed on her. I suppose you have questions, Clara said, her voice gentle yet edged with fatigue. Eleanor nodded. You knew my husband. James Holloway. Clara flinched at the name. Yes. I did. She looked towards the window, the mist outside pressing against the glass like a ghost desperate to come in. James was complicated. We met during a summer production in Bristol. He was charming. Persistent. Said he was only there for business, but he returned, again and again. Eleanor felt her chest tighten. I had no idea he was married, Clara added quickly. Not at first. There was a pause. Then Clara reached for a small wooden box on the bookshelf. She opened it and drew out another photograph. This one showed James with his arms wrapped tightly around Clara, and in front of them stood a boy, perhaps 3 years old. His dark curls and pale eyes were unmistakable. Eleanor stared at the child. Her hand flew to her mouth. Is that? Yes, Clara replied quietly. His name was Thomas. James's son. The room felt suddenly too small. But he never told me. Never mentioned a child. Clara looked down. Because Thomas died. When he was 8. Heart failure. It was fast. Cruel. And after that, James never came back. Not really. He stopped writing. Stopped calling. I suppose he buried it deep, chose a different life. With you. Eleanor gripped the arms of the chair, the edges of her vision swimming. He never told me, she whispered again. Clara reached into the box once more and handed over a small stack of folded paper. Letters. All from James. All written in a hand Eleanor now recognized too well. I kept them. Even after he stopped replying. They're yours if you want them. Eleanor took the letters, her fingers shaking. She opened the topmost one. The date was just weeks after Thomas's funeral. I don't know who I am anymore, the letter began. I thought I could split myself in two, but I've failed you. I've failed him. I hear his laughter in the trees and I see his eyes every time I close mine. Forgive me, Clara. I cannot survive this. A tear slid down Eleanor's cheek. All the years she thought she'd known her husband. Clara's voice was barely a whisper. He was broken. And I don't think he ever truly healed. The silence hung heavy. But Eleanor had one more question. Why did he hide this photograph behind the wall? Clara looked surprised. I never sent that photo. James took it the day before he left for good. I didn't even know it still existed. Eleanor's thoughts churned. If James had kept that photograph, hidden it away, it meant something. A memory too painful to destroy. Or a secret he feared would one day come to light. Clara placed a hand on Eleanor's. He loved you. I'm sure of it. But part of him was always elsewhere. As Eleanor drove home later that day, the box of letters on the passenger seat beside her, the image of the boy haunted her. And so did one pressing question. If James had hidden the photograph, what else had he hidden? Eleanor returned to the cottage with her thoughts spiraling. The wind outside howled across the fields, and storm clouds had begun to gather over Westridge. Yet the storm inside her was far more turbulent. That night, she couldn't sleep. The letters from Clara sat on the dining table, untouched since she brought them home. James's handwriting felt like a ghost's touch, each loop and line a whisper from the past. Eleanor read them again and again, trying to map the journey of a man torn in two. At 3 a.m, she rose, driven by something deeper than curiosity. She found herself standing in the hallway outside the old study, the room where she had first discovered the photograph. The floor creaked beneath her feet as she stepped inside. She switched on the small desk lamp and cast her eyes over the bare room. The fireplace. The bookcase. The faded rug with curling corners. Her gaze settled on the floorboards near the wall where the photograph had been hidden. A memory stirred. James had once scolded the handyman for pulling up a loose floorboard. Said something about wanting the floor left untouched. At the time, Eleanor had thought nothing of it. Now, her breath quickened. She knelt and ran her fingers along the edge of the boards. One felt different, its corner slightly raised. With the handle of a nearby letter opener, she prized it free. Dust billowed into the air. Beneath the plank lay a shallow cavity, and inside it, a leather-bound notebook and a small velvet pouch. Eleanor's heart pounded. She took out the notebook first. Its pages were brittle with age, the ink faded but still legible. These were James's words, more personal than any letter he had written to Clara. More desperate. Every day I pretend. Pretend to be the man Eleanor thinks I am. But Thomas's face still visits me in dreams. And the choices I made. She flipped ahead. I made a deal. I was young. Foolish. Desperate to save my boy. I didn't care what it cost. But the boy died anyway. And now. I think I've brought something back with me. Something wrong. Eleanor froze. A deal. She blinked, reading the passage again. James had never believed in superstition, let alone anything dark or mystical. He was pragmatic, always skeptical. But these words were laced with something else, fear. She opened the velvet pouch with trembling fingers. Inside was a delicate silver pendant, shaped like a crescent moon, with strange etchings along the edge. She didn't recognize the symbols. She touched it, and instantly recoiled. The metal was ice cold, unnaturally so, even though it had been buried under warm wooden boards. A whisper seemed to echo around the room. She stood up quickly, pendant in hand, and the shadows in the corners seemed to lengthen. Suddenly, the lamp flickered. The flame in the hearth, long extinguished, gave a single hiss, as if something had moved through it. Eleanor backed out of the study, her breaths coming faster. The pendant still lay in her palm, its chill now seeping into her skin. James had made a deal. And something had followed him home. The morning brought no comfort. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, the pendant placed before her on a napkin, as though touching the wood might somehow make it safer. Sunlight streamed in weakly, but even that seemed hesitant to reach the object. She hadn't slept. The notebook remained open beside her, its confessions laid bare. The pendant, though inanimate, seemed to pulse with something unnatural. A presence. A weight. She rang Father Rowe just after 7. The vicar arrived within the hour, his face drawn and pale when she handed him the notebook and showed him the pendant. He read in silence, turning each brittle page as though they might crumble in his hands. When he finally looked up, his voice was tight. "This isn't just guilt, Eleanor. Your husband believed he'd invited something into his life. Something dark." "But he was rational," she replied, her voice shaking. "He never spoke of any of this. Not even when Thomas died." "Grief makes people reach," Father Rowe said softly. "But sometimes, in our desperation, we reach into places best left untouched." He asked to take the pendant and the notebook for safekeeping. Eleanor hesitated, then agreed, relieved to have the object out of the house. Yet the silence that followed its removal felt wrong. As if something had been disturbed. That afternoon, she wandered the halls of the cottage, noticing how cold it felt. Her own reflection in the hallway mirror appeared strange, a beat out of sync. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed slower. Or faster. She couldn't be sure. Then came the knock. 3 gentle raps at the front door. She opened it without thinking. No one was there. She stepped onto the porch, glancing across the lane. Empty. And then, something shifted behind her. She spun around, nothing. But the air had changed. Denser. She could smell it, something like smoke, mixed with old flowers. The living room light buzzed faintly, and as she turned to walk back in, she froze. On the hallway wall, the exact place where she had found the hidden photograph, there was now another. It hadn't been there that morning. Her heart galloped as she stepped closer. This one was different. Sepia-toned, weathered, and grainy. It showed the front of Westridge Cottage, unmistakable even through the years. But in the window, James's study window, stood a figure. A woman in a black veil, her hands pressed to the glass, as though trying to get out. Eleanor staggered back. She hadn't placed this photograph there. No one had entered the house. The air grew heavier. She grabbed the photo and rushed to the phone, dialing Father Rowe. No answer. Then, from upstairs, a sound. Not footsteps exactly, but something dragging. Slow. Scraping across the floor. She climbed the stairs, trembling with every step. The corridor was empty. But her bedroom door was ajar. And on the bed lay the pendant. Returned. Still cold. Still pulsing. Eleanor stared at the pendant lying on her bed. Her chest heaved with tight, shallow breaths as she edged closer, unable to comprehend how it had returned. Father Rowe had taken it. She had watched him place it into his satchel, had watched him leave the house with it. And yet, here it was, resting on the crumpled bedspread like it had never left. A low creak echoed from somewhere deep in the house. She snatched the pendant with trembling fingers, intending to lock it away, but the moment her skin made contact, she froze. A rush of sensation crashed over her, cold, choking, like she'd been plunged into icy water. And then, a voice. Soft. whimpering. Eleanor. Her own name. The pendant slipped from her grasp and fell to the floor with a dull thud. She stumbled backwards and gripped the bedpost, heart thundering in her ears. The photograph. The veiled woman. The dragging sounds. All of it was leading her somewhere. Not knowing what else to do, Eleanor returned to the hallway and stared at the spot where she had first discovered the photograph hidden behind the plaster. Her eyes scanned the wall, searching. Listening. The silence this time felt unnatural. Waiting. She took the fire poker from beside the hearth and struck the wall. The first blow cracked the paint. The second loosened the plaster. With each hit, dust filled the air, ancient and musty. And then, her third strike gave way to something hollow. Behind the crumbling plaster was a narrow space, an old wall cavity. She reached inside. Her fingers touched paper. Then, fabric. She pulled out an old wooden box, scorched in one corner. Inside, a bundle of letters, wrapped in string, brittle with age. And beneath them, something far more sinister, a torn piece of a child's dress, stained dark. Her stomach turned. The letters were addressed in the same curling script she'd seen before, Catherine Rowley. The first one dated back to 1923. Eleanor sat on the floor and began to read. Each letter was a descent into madness. Catherine spoke of voices in the walls, of a presence in the mirror, of dreams that weren't hers. She wrote of a child, her child, who had vanished one winter's night and never returned. And how the house remembered. The final letter ended in a splatter of ink, the words frantic and broken. I see her. In the window. I see her every night. I cannot leave. The house keeps her. The house keeps us both. Eleanor let the letter fall to her lap. Her vision blurred, a rising pressure in her head, a scream not yet formed. The mirror in the hallway shimmered. A flicker of movement. She turned just in time to see a face in the glass. Not her own. A pale woman. Veiled. Mouth open. Screaming. Then silence. The glass cracked. And Eleanor, frozen in the hallway, realized something chilling. The house didn't just remember. It wanted her to remember too.